The gun was already in her hand when she said it. Violet Baker stood at the edge of the split-rail fence that bordered Albert Dawson's property, the last embers of a desert sunset bleeding red across the Arizona sky behind her travel bag at her feet, her horse already tied to the post and ready for the road south. She had not slept in 2 days. Her hands were not shaking, though they probably should have been, and her jaw was set with the kind of resolve that comes from a woman who has made a decision and made peace with it, or tried to. "I did not come here meaning to stay," she whispered. Albert Dawson was standing on the porch of his adobe and timber ranch house, arms at his sides, hat in his hands, watching her the way a man watches something precious slide toward the edge of a table and knows he cannot catch it in time. He had a gash above his right eyebrow from the night before, still raw, still rimmed dark with dried blood. He had not slept either. His eyes were steady, though, steadier than anything else in that moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who already knew the answer to every question she had not yet asked. "I know," he said, "and yet here you are." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Violet Baker had ever heard in her 26 years of living. It pressed against her chest like a hand. She kept her eyes on him. He kept his eyes on her. The horse shifted its weight against the post. Somewhere out past the dry wash, a coyote called once and went quiet, and the whole territory seemed to hold its breath. She had come to Redemption, Arizona, in the spring of 1882 with exactly one purpose, a purpose that had nothing to do with staying, nothing to do with ranch houses or desert sunsets or men with kind eyes and difficult secrets. She had come to collect a debt that had been owed to her dead father for 15 years, and she had meant to be gone before the summer heat made the roads impassable. But that was 3 months ago, and this was now, and Albert Dawson was looking at her from that porch with an expression she could not fully decode and did not entirely want to. Because if she decoded it, she would have to do something about it, and doing something about it meant putting down the bag. She was not sure she was ready to put down the bag, but she was still standing there, and he was right. Here she was. To understand how Violet Baker arrived at this particular moment, at this particular fence, with this particular man watching her from a porch at dusk in the Arizona territory, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the letter. It arrived at the boarding house in Santa Fe on a Tuesday in late March of 1882, and it was the third such letter in as many months, all of them from the same source, all of them ignored. But this one was different. This one was not a summons or a threat. This one was a reckoning. The letter was from a lawyer by the name of Jeremiah Howell, operating out of the town of Redemption, a dry and stubborn little settlement 3 days' hard ride south of the Mogollon Rim, and it stated, in the careful and bloodless language of legal correspondence, that the matter of one Benjamin Baker's outstanding stake in the Redemption Valley Cattle and Land Consortium could no longer be deferred, as the principal debtor, one Clarence Voss, had recently passed away, and the estate was being settled. If the surviving heir did not appear in Redemption within 60 days to make her claim, the stake would be dissolved and the assets absorbed by the remaining partners. Benjamin Baker had been dead for 11 years. He had been Violet's father. He had, before his death, been a man of considerable energy and modest means, a cattle broker from Tucson who had put almost every dollar he owned into a land venture he believed would make his daughter's future secure. The venture had been controlled by Clarence Voss, a man Violet's mother had described, in the weeks before her own death, as handsome in the way that rotten wood looks sound until you step on it. The money had never come back to them. The letters to Voss had gone unanswered. The lawyers had said there was nothing to be done. And Violet had grown up in a series of boarding houses and domestic positions, learning to read faster than the other girls, to calculate sums in her head, to trust almost no one, and to keep her anger banked low and manageable, like a fire that you need to last through a long winter. She had been 23 when her mother died and left her with $200 in savings, a silver locket, and the address of Jeremiah Howell's legal office in Redemption, which her mother had written down in the back of a Bible as though it were a prayer she was not sure God was going to answer. 3 years had passed. Violet had moved to Santa Fe, taken a position as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant, saved her money, and told herself she was waiting for the right moment. But the truth, which she was only willing to examine late at night when the rest of the boarding house was quiet, was that she had been afraid. Not of Clarence Voss in particular, but of the specific kind of disappointment that comes when you have built a hope into something so solid that you can feel the weight of it in your hands, and then discover that what you were holding was nothing at all. The letter from Jeremiah Howell changed the calculation. She had 60 days, or the chance was gone entirely. So she packed her bag, settled her affairs, wrote a brief and businesslike note to her employer explaining her departure, and rode south into the Arizona territory with her father's name in her chest like a coal that would not cool. She arrived in Redemption on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, and the first thing that struck her about the town was that it was smaller than she expected and louder than it had any right to be. The main street was a single unpaved corridor of commerce and survival, bordered by a general store, a blacksmith, a post office, a 2-story hotel called the Sutherland House, a saloon called the Brass Rail, and a scattering of smaller establishments that appeared to be held together by determination and dry rot. The surrounding landscape was all red rock and creosote brush, and the kind of silence that fills up the spaces between noises rather than replacing them. She tied her horse at the post outside the Sutherland House, checked in with the proprietress, a wide-shouldered woman named Mrs. Ida Sutherland, who had the permanent expression of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, and then walked 3 doors down to the office of Jeremiah Howell. Howell was a thin man in his 50s with a white mustache and the kind of nervous intelligence that comes from spending a lifetime navigating other people's disasters. He received her professionally, offered her water from a clay pitcher, confirmed the substance of his letter, and then leaned back in his chair with his fingers laced together and told her something the letter had not mentioned. "The estate of Clarence Voss is being disputed," he said. "There are 2 surviving partners in the consortium who are making claims on the assets. One is a gentleman from Prescott named Theodore Marsh. The other is a local rancher by the name of Albert Dawson." "And what are they claiming?" Violet asked. "That your father's original stake was paid out before his death, and that the remaining interest belongs to them. They have documents to that effect." Violet felt the familiar cold settling in her stomach. "Are the documents genuine?" Howell paused in a way that said everything. "That," he said carefully, "is what would need to be determined." She walked out of his office and stood on the unpaved street in the late afternoon light and breathed through the anger until it became something she could work with. 15 years. The stake had been stolen from her father 15 years ago, and now there were 2 men with forged documents standing between her and what was left of it. She was going to need to know which of the 2 men was the more dangerous, and which one might be the weak point in the lie. She found out the answer to the first question that same evening at the Brass Rail, not because she went there with any intention of gathering intelligence, but because Theodore Marsh found her first. She had only sat down to eat, having no desire to take her supper in the Sutherland House dining room, where Mrs. Ida Sutherland watched her guests with the focused attention of someone running a very small prison. The Brass Rail served food in addition to liquor, and the food was plain but substantial, and Violet was hungry from the road. Theodore Marsh appeared at her table without invitation. He was tall and barrel-chested, perhaps 45, with the over-groomed confidence of a man who had learned early that physical size and a well-cut suit could substitute for actual intelligence in most social situations. He had small pale eyes and a smile that went on a beat longer than it should have. "Miss Baker," he said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down without asking permission. "I was told you arrived today. I hope we might speak." "You have the advantage of knowing my name," she said. "I have only your appearance to go on, and I would rather hear what you have to say before I form opinions about your appearance." Something moved behind his small, pale eyes. He smiled again, more careful this time. "Theodore Marsh. I was a partner in the consortium with your father, God rest him." "You were a partner with Clarence Voss," she said. "My father was an investor." "There is a difference," the smile held. "Of course. I wanted to extend my condolences and also to suggest that what might be best for everyone is a quiet resolution. The documents Mr. Howell has reviewed indicate that your father's stake was settled before his passing, but I understand there are sentimental claims involved, and I am prepared to offer you a modest sum in exchange for your signature on a release." "How modest?" $250. Violet looked at him for a long moment. The original stake had been $1,200. 15 years of compound growth on a cattle and land venture that had done well by all available accounts would have made that stake worth several times that amount. "That is a generous offer," she said pleasantly. "I will give it the consideration it deserves." She finished her meal, walked back to the Sutherland house, and sat at the small desk in her room by lamplight making a list of everything she would need to prove forgery in a frontier jurisdiction in the Arizona Territory of 1882, which was not a simple list, and which was going to require resources and allies she did not yet have. She fell asleep with the list in her lap and dreamed, briefly and without much clarity, of her father's voice reading to her from a cattle ledger when she was small, explaining how numbers told stories if you knew how to listen. She met Albert Dawson the following morning. She had risen before the sun, taken her horse from the livery where she had boarded it the previous night, and ridden out to look at the land in question, a stretch of river-bottom grazing ground 3 miles east of town, where the Redemption Consortium had originally established its cattle operations. She wanted to see it with her own eyes before she formed any further assessments. The land was good. Better than she expected. The grass was deep where it followed the wash, and the red cliffs on the eastern side broke the worst of the wind. A small herd of Hereford cattle were grazing in the lower pasture, well kept and healthy. There was a windmill and a water tank in the middle distance, and beyond that, the ranch house she would later come to know very well, the adobe and timber structure with the split-rail fence around it, and the porch where a man was now standing watching her ride in as though he had been expecting her for some time. He was not what she expected. She had formed, on the basis of Jeremiah Howell's description and Theodore Marsh's existence, a general mental image of the second partner that involved some version of the first. So the man who walked off the porch toward her horse was a correction to several assumptions at once. Albert Dawson was perhaps 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who does real physical work, with dark hair that needed cutting and steady brown eyes, and an expression of complete composure that might have been mistaken for indifference if you were not looking carefully. He was looking carefully at her. She noticed that immediately. "You rode out from Sutherland's," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she said, staying on her horse, which was a deliberate choice. "Miss Baker, I expect. Jeremiah Howell sent word you'd come. He looked at the land around them and then back at her. You wanted to see it. I wanted to see what I came for. That's reasonable." He put his hands in his pockets. "I would have done the same." It was not the response she expected, and she marked it. "Are you going to tell me to leave?" she asked. "No," he said. "This is open land. Ride wherever you like." He paused. "I would stay east of the dry wash. The footing gets soft in places after the spring rains." She looked at him for another moment, recalibrating. "You are one of the men contesting my father's stake." "I am one of the men named in the legal proceedings," he said carefully. "Is there a difference?" He looked at her steadily. "There might be. Depends what you find when you start looking." Then he turned and walked back toward the ranch house, and she sat on her horse in the morning light and watched him go and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Redemption, that this particular situation was significantly more complicated than she had initially assessed. She was annoyed to find that she was intrigued. The next 2 weeks were a study in controlled investigation. Violet established a routine quickly. Mornings she spent at Jeremiah Howell's office, working through the documents related to the consortium with the focused precision of someone who had learned to read ledgers before she learned to read novels. Howell was cooperative in the limited way of a cautious man. He gave her access to what was in the public record and kept his opinions about the rest of it behind a careful professional neutrality. What she found, the more she looked, was a pattern. The documents claiming that her father's stake had been paid out were dated from 1871, 2 years before his death. They bore her father's signature and were witnessed by Clarence Voss himself and one Theodore Marsh. The handwriting on the signature, when she compared it against the 2 genuine letters from her father that she had kept in the back of her Bible, was close but not identical. The loops on the capital B were wrong. Her father had always made his capital B with a single continuous motion from the bottom up. The signature on the settlement document came down first. It was not conclusive by itself, but it was something. She also discovered, in the course of her review of the consortium's operating records, that Albert Dawson had not joined the venture until 1875, 4 years after her father's stake was allegedly settled, and 2 years after Benjamin Baker's death. He had bought in as a working partner with land and labor rather than capital, which meant that whatever documents existed predating his involvement, he had not created them and had likely not seen the originals. She did not share this observation with anyone yet. Instead, she rode out east of town on a Thursday afternoon and found Albert Dawson mending fences in the lower pasture, working with an easy economy of motion that suggested he had done it enough times to stop thinking about it and let his hands take over. "I have a question," she said, pulling up her horse. He straightened and looked at her with the same careful composure. "All right. When you bought into the consortium in 1875, what were you told about the original investors?" A pause. He took off his work gloves and considered the question as if he were giving it the same respect he would give a difficult animal. "Voss told me the original backers had been paid out and the operation was mine and his going forward. Marsh came in a year later. I had no reason to doubt him at the time." "Did you ever see the settlement documents?" Another pause, longer this time. "Not the originals. I saw copies when Voss's estate started being sorted. Something bother you about them?" She studied him. The sun was behind him and his face was in shadow, and she could not read his expression as well as she wanted to. "My father made his capital B in a particular way," she said. "Every letter he ever wrote, the signature on the settlement document is wrong." The silence that followed was different from the other silences they had shared. This one had weight to it. "You're saying the documents are forged," he said. "I am saying the signature does not match my father's genuine hand." "I would need a document examiner with proper expertise to say more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She had not expected that either. She had expected defensiveness, or legal maneuvering, or a variation of Marsh's approach. She had not expected the question to be that direct or that immediate. "I need to understand what you knew and when," she said. "And I need access to any original documents you have from the consortium's formation that predate your involvement." "I have a box of papers Voss gave me when I bought in," he said. "Some of them go back to the beginning. I have not been through all of them." He put his work gloves back on. "Come by the ranch house Saturday morning. I'll have them ready." She rode back toward town feeling several things simultaneously, which she found inconvenient. The box of papers Albert Dawson laid out on his kitchen table that Saturday morning was substantial and revealing. He had made coffee, strong and plain, and poured her a cup without ceremony, and then sat across the table and let her work through the documents without interruption, which was more consideration than she had received from anyone since Jeremiah Howell. What the box contained, buried under operating ledgers and supply invoices, was a copy of the original partnership agreement from 1869. It listed all 4 original investors, including Benjamin Baker, and it set out in clear legal language the terms under which stakes could be bought out or transferred. Those terms were specific. A buyout required a notarized agreement signed by both parties, witnessed by a disinterested third party, and recorded with the Territorial Land Office. No such recording existed in the Land Office records. Howell had confirmed this for her in their review of the public records. She had not mentioned its significance until now. She set the partnership agreement on the table and turned it so Albert could read the relevant section. He read it. She watched his face. What she saw there was not guilt. What she saw was the particular expression of a person who has just understood how thoroughly they have been deceived. If the buyout was never recorded, he said quietly, then the settlement documents are not just forged, they are fraudulent in a way that can be proven through the public record. Yes, she said. He looked at her steadily. Marsh knew this. I believe so, yes. And Voss created it. Marsh benefited from it. The question now is what to do about it. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the agreement. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, something direct and uncomplicated, as though all the careful professional distance between them had just been set aside. Miss Baker, he said, your father was wronged. Badly. And I have been operating on land and under a legal structure that was built on that wrong. I did not know it, but that does not change what is owed to you. He paused. I will help you prove it, whatever you need. Violet Baker had spent a long time in her life expecting disappointment from people. She had built very efficient systems for processing it. What she had not built was a system for processing the opposite, and she found that the absence of that system left her without the appropriate response for approximately 3 seconds, which for her was a very long time. Thank you, she said finally. It came out quieter than she intended. Do not thank me yet, he said. Marsh is not going to give this up without a fight, and he has money and men, and the territorial court is not always a friend to people without political connections. He paused again. He is also not above other kinds of persuasion. The warning proved accurate faster than either of them anticipated. Within 4 days of Violet's Saturday visit to the ranch, Theodore Marsh's men had begun making their presence felt. Small things at first. Her horse was found untied from the post outside the Sutherland house one morning, which might have been carelessness, except that Violet did not make that kind of mistake. A page went missing from Jeremiah Howell's copy of the consortium records, a page that contained the original investment amounts, which Howell discovered only when Violet asked to see it again, and he spent 20 minutes looking for something that was no longer where he had placed it. And one afternoon, returning from the land office where she had been reviewing recording histories, a man she did not recognize fell into step beside her on the main street and told her, in a pleasant and conversational tone, that the road south was fine this time of year, and that a woman traveling alone might find it considerably safer than the road that stayed. She walked back to the Sutherland house with her heart beating faster than she liked, and her face perfectly composed, and she sat in her room and thought about what the word trap implied when someone set one carefully enough to look like a suggestion. She was being pressured to leave before she could complete the legal work, and the pressure was going to escalate. She knew that with the certainty of someone who has read enough ledgers to recognize when a pattern is building toward a conclusion. She rode out to Albert Dawson's ranch the next morning early, before the heat settled in, and found him at the water tank repairing the windmill mechanism. He came down the ladder when he saw her, and she told him everything without preamble, including the man on the street, because she did not believe in handling this kind of thing alone when there was someone trustworthy enough to tell. She was still working out whether Albert Dawson was trustworthy enough. But the events of the last several days were moving toward a conclusion faster than she had planned, and she was recalibrating. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, He was quiet for a moment, looking past her at the middle distance with an expression that was not anger exactly, but was in the vicinity of it. "He's putting you on a clock," Albert said. "He wants you to make a mistake or leave before you can get the documents to a court." "Yes," she said. "We need to move faster then." He looked at her. "I know a man in Prescott, a document examiner properly trained. He testified in a land case 3 years ago. If we can get your father's letters and the settlement document to him, he can give us a proper opinion." "How long would that take?" "Round trip to Prescott, a week, maybe 10 days. And Marsh will know the moment we start." "Probably." Albert looked at his hands, then back at her. "There is another option. The circuit judge comes through redemption in 6 weeks. If we can get the evidence organized and the complaint filed with Howell, we can present it when he arrives. Marsh cannot block a judicial proceeding once it's properly filed." "6 weeks," she said. "6 weeks," he confirmed. "He will do a great deal in 6 weeks if he thinks he is losing." "Yes," Albert said, "he will." They stood there in the morning sun, and Violet thought about 6 weeks and a circuit judge and Theodore Marsh with his small pale eyes and his pleasant voice suggesting she take the southern road. And she thought about her father's capital B and the number 1200, and what it would have grown to in 15 years of good cattle land. "All right," she said. 6 weeks. What do we do first?" What they did first was establish a system. Albert identified the original consortium charter documents that needed to be certified and sent for examination. Violet worked with Howell to draft the formal complaint. They communicated through Howell's office initially, which provided a degree of legal cover, but Marsh had friends in town, and the cover was imperfect. So within a week they had established a secondary arrangement where Violet would ride out to the ranch 3 mornings a week on the pretext of examining the land in which she had a legal interest, which was entirely true and therefore entirely defensible. The work brought them into close proximity for hours at a time, across the kitchen table where the documents were spread, or on horseback riding the property line, while Albert explained the operation's history in the careful way he had of laying out facts without editorializing. She learned things about him during those 3 weeks that she had not expected to learn and had not intended to find interesting. He had come to Arizona Territory from Missouri at the age of 22, after his father's farm failed during the drought years, and there was nothing left to stay for. He had worked cattle for wages for 3 years before Clarence Voss had made him the offer of a working partnership, which he had accepted because the land was good and the arrangement seemed sound. He had turned the operation into something real through 7 years of steady work, and he was not, as she had initially assumed, a man who had simply inherited advantage. He had built what he had out of labor and judgment, and what he had built was solid and quiet and decent. He was also, she discovered gradually, a man who was more perceptive than he generally chose to appear. He noticed things, the way she organized her documents, the fact that she was left-handed but had been trained to write with her right, the way she went still and composed when something alarmed her rather than showing visible reaction. "You learned to hide it young," he said one afternoon, not unkindly. "Reacting." She looked up from the papers. "I was in enough situations where reacting made things worse." "So was I," he said, and said nothing more about it, which she appreciated more than she expected to. What she did not expect and was not prepared for was the afternoon in the 4th week when he looked up from a document they were reviewing together, and she realized that they were leaning close over the same page and had been for several minutes, and that the distance between them had reduced to something that required noticing, and that when she looked up and found him already looking at her, neither of them moved away immediately. She moved away eventually. She made a note about the document. She kept her voice level. But something had shifted in the room, and they both knew it, and they both behaved as though they did not know it for several more days, which required a degree of effort that she was aware of even when she was not thinking about it. The danger came in the 5th week, which in retrospect was entirely predictable. Marsh had been watching the legal proceedings develop through whatever network of informants he maintained in redemption, and by the 5th week, he had apparently concluded that the quiet approach was not going to be sufficient. So he tried a different approach. He went after the documents. Jeremiah Howell's office was broken into on a Tuesday night. Whoever did it was professional. There was no obvious damage to the door, which suggested either a duplicate key or a lock pick, and the filing cabinet where Howell kept the consortium materials had been opened cleanly. The complaint draft was taken. The certified copy of the original partnership agreement was taken. The copies of the land office recording history were taken. What was not taken was the original partnership agreement from Albert's box, because Albert had not given it to Howell. He had kept it at the ranch, in a fireproof iron box he kept buried in the floor of the tack room, a precaution he had maintained for years out of habit, and that now, at this particular moment, proved to be the most consequential decision in the entire case. And what else was not taken was Violet's own notebook, in which she had transcribed every relevant figure, date, and legal reference in her own hand, because Violet Baker did not trust a single location with all of her most important information. She kept the notebook in her room at the Sutherland house. When Howell sent word to Albert on Wednesday morning, Albert rode into town and then rode directly to the Sutherland house and knocked on the door of Violet's room, which Mrs. Ida Sutherland found extremely objectionable, but which neither Albert nor Violet had any particular interest in addressing at that moment. Violet stood in the doorway looking at him, and immediately understood from his expression that something had gone wrong. He told her what it was. She was quiet for exactly the amount of time it took to integrate the information. "He has the drafts," she said. "He does not have the originals." "No, I still have the partnership agreement, and I have something else." He paused. "I found a letter in the box of papers Voss gave me. I had not looked at it before. It is from Voss to Marsh, dated 1873, 3 months after your father died. It discusses the settlement documents being signed correctly. The word he uses is convincingly." She stared at him. "He wrote it down." Voss was not always careful. He had been drinking when he wrote it, I think. "The handwriting is loose." "That is evidence of conspiracy," she said. "That plus the partnership agreement plus the land office records puts this beyond any reasonable dispute." "I know," he said, "which means Marsh is going to realize he is out of options, and when he does, he is not going to be reasonable about it." She looked at him in the doorway, thinking quickly. The circuit judge was due in 11 days. 11 days of Marsh knowing he was cornered. 11 days of a man who had already had her warned off and her documents stolen, operating without options. "I cannot stay at the Sutherland house," she said. "If he sent someone to Howell's office with a key, he can send someone here." "No," Albert said, and then he paused in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "You should stay at the ranch. You would not be the first person I have given shelter to, and Mrs. Sutherland's opinion notwithstanding, there is a proper guest room and it would not be irregular given the legal circumstances." She considered him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching. "All right," she said. That was a decision that changed everything, though she did not acknowledge that fact at the time, even to herself. The ranch house was quieter than the Sutherland house and cooler in the mornings and smelled of cedar and leather and the particular clean smell of open land. Albert gave her the guest room, which was spare and private, and did not treat her presence there as anything other than a practical arrangement, which she appreciated and also found slightly maddening in a way she was not examining closely. They settled into a routine. She worked on the documents in the mornings. He did the work of the ranch. They had dinner together in the evenings at the kitchen table, sometimes working, sometimes not. He was not a voluble man at dinner, but he was not silent in an uncomfortable way. He asked her questions sometimes about Santa Fe, about the work she had done there, about her mother. She answered them. She asked him questions in return, and he answered those with the same careful directness he brought to everything. She found out that he had taught himself to read Spanish from a vaquero who had worked on the ranch for 2 years before returning to Sonora. That he kept 3 dogs who had no practical use whatsoever and who slept on the porch. That he had broken his left hand once badly enough that 2 of the fingers had not set quite straight, and she had noticed the slight misalignment and had not said anything, and he told her about it one evening without her asking, as though he had been waiting to see whether she would, and the fact that she had not had perhaps meant something. On the 8th evening, after a long day of document organization and a quiet dinner, they were sitting on the porch in the last of the light when he said, without preamble, "Do you want to go back to Santa Fe after this is settled?" She looked at the darkening sky. "I have a position there," she said, "a life that I built." "That is not what I asked," he said gently. She was quiet. One of his dogs leaned against her leg, and she put her hand on its head absently and thought about what he was really asking and what the honest answer was. "I do not know," she said finally. "That is fair," he said. They sat in the darkening quiet, and she was aware that this was a very specific kind of moment, the kind that does not come frequently and that cannot be re-entered once it has passed. She did not say anything else that evening. Neither did he. But something in the quality of the silence between them was different from any silence they had shared before. The attack came 2 nights before the circuit judge was due to arrive. It came at night, which was expected, and it came fast, which was less expected. 3 men rode onto the property well after midnight, when the moon had set and the dark was complete. They were not subtle about it. They came to take the iron box from the tack room, and they knew exactly where it was, which meant someone had talked, and the someone was not difficult to identify since very few people knew the box existed. Albert was awake when they came. He had been sleeping lightly for most of the week, wary, and the sound of hooves on dry ground was something his body registered before his conscious mind did. He was on his feet and at the door with his rifle before Violet was fully awake. She came out of the guest room with her boots already on, which said something about her, and he had a brief moment of profound gratitude for her clear-headedness before the first man hit the door of the tack room, and he had to focus entirely on what was happening. What followed was not prolonged. Albert was a good shot, as most men who lived alone on working ranches in the Arizona Territory were, and 2 of the 3 men were not committed enough to stay when the first warning shot proved that the occupant of the ranch was awake and armed and competent. They rode back the way they had come. The 3rd man, who had already gotten the tack room door open, found that the iron box had been moved 2 nights prior. Albert had relocated it to below the kitchen floor, under the same board where he kept the ready cash, because he had expected something like this. The 3rd man left empty-handed. Violet and Albert stood on the porch in the dark for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. "They will tell Marsh," Violet said. "Yes," Albert said. "He will know the box was moved. He will know we anticipated him. Yes, he may try again before the judge arrives." "Yes," Albert said, "or he may try something else entirely." The something else was a visit to Jeremiah Howell the following morning, in which Marsh apparently spent a significant amount of time suggesting that the entire matter could be settled generously if Howell encouraged his client to accept a revised offer. The revised offer, when Howell related to Violet with the careful neutrality of a man trying to remain professionally uninvolved, was $500. "He is afraid," Albert said when Violet told him. $500 instead of $250, she said. "Yes, he is. The judge arrives tomorrow. I know." She looked at him across the kitchen table, surrounded by organized documents and clean copies, and the letter from Voss to Marsh that was going to be the central exhibit in what was about to happen. And she felt something she had not expected to feel in this kitchen, or in this territory, or in proximity to this particular man. A sudden and clarifying emotion that she identified with some alarm as the simple and unambiguous desire to not leave. She did not say anything about it. There was a circuit judge arriving tomorrow and a case to be won and a man named Marsh to be held accountable, and this was not the moment for anything else. The hearing before Judge Elias Comstock took place in the Town Hall of Redemption on a Thursday morning in early June of 1882, and it lasted most of the day. Marsh had brought a lawyer from Prescott, an older man named Freeling who had an impressive beard and a confident manner, and who raised numerous procedural objections in the opening hours that Comstock dispatched with the efficient irritation of a man who had seen every delay tactic in 3 decades of circuit work. Howell presented Violet's case with more spirit than she had expected from him, perhaps because the evidence was sufficiently compelling that it required very little oratory and a great deal of simple documentation. The partnership agreement established the buyout conditions. The land office records confirmed no compliant buyout had been recorded. The comparative handwriting between Benjamin Baker's genuine letters and the settlement document signature was presented, along with a sworn statement from the document examiner in Prescott who had reviewed photographs of both. And the letter from Voss to Marsh was read aloud into the record, and the word convincingly hung in the air of the town hall like smoke. Freeling tried to argue that the letter was open to interpretation. Judge Comstock listened to the argument, made a brief note, and then spent the last hour of the afternoon asking questions of Theodore Marsh directly, in the style of a man who has heard a very great deal of dishonesty and has developed efficient methods for identifying it. Marsh's confident manner did not survive the last half hour of direct questioning. The small, pale eyes moved too much, and his answers about dates and documents began to contradict each other in small ways that Comstock marked and returned to with the patience of someone who is not in a hurry because he already knows the conclusion. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Judge Comstock ruled. Benjamin Baker's stake had never been legitimately bought out. The settlement documents were fraudulent. The interest in the consortium that belonged to Benjamin Baker, now the property of his surviving heir Violet Baker, was valid and enforceable. Marsh was ordered to provide an accounting of the consortium's operating profits for the relevant period, from which Violet's portion would be calculated and paid, with interest at the legal rate. Theodore Marsh left Redemption the following morning and did not return. Violet sat in the town hall after the judge left and the other participants had filtered out, with only Jeremiah Howell across the table from her, and felt the particular exhaustion of something having been finished. Not sadness, not exhilaration, but the specific quietness of a long-held tension finally releasing. "You should know," Howell said carefully, "that the accounting is likely to show a significant sum. The ranch has done well." "I know," she said. "Will you remain in Redemption to oversee the process?" It could take some months. She thought about her position in Santa Fe. She thought about the boarding house and the dry goods merchant's ledgers and the life that she had described as one she had built, which was true, and which was also, she recognized now with the precision she brought to most things, a life that had been shaped more by what she was running from than what she was running toward. "I will remain," she said, "for the time being." She walked out of the town hall into the late afternoon light and found Albert Dawson standing in the street, leaning against the hitching post with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly, because he had been there for the last hour waiting for the outcome, and when he saw her face he understood it immediately and something in his own expression opened like a window. "It went well," he said. "It went well," she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment and then he smiled. It was not a small smile. Not the careful, controlled kind she had been seeing for weeks. It was a real one, wide and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, and she stood there in the Redemption Town Hall Street in early June 1882 and thought that she was in a very significant amount of trouble. "I would like to buy you dinner at the Brass Rail," he said, "if you are willing to tolerate the location a second time." "The food is reasonable," she said. "It is," he agreed. They walked to the Brass Rail side by side in the early evening light, and it was the first time they had walked anywhere together without a document between them, and the absence of that document made the distance between them feel different, closer, or at least more noticed. Dinner at the Brass Rail was not a business meeting. This was the first time that had been clearly true. They talked about things that were not the case. He told her about the winter before last, when the snow had come early, and he had spent 3 days tracking 2 lost heifers through the Mogollon country, and found them in a canyon with a band of deer, as though they had all simply agreed to winter together. She told him about the time she had caught a significant arithmetic error in a supply invoice that had been saving her employer's business partner $300 a year for 5 years, and the expression on the merchant's face when she presented him with the corrected accounting. He listened to her with the full attention of a person who is genuinely interested rather than simply waiting for his own turn to speak, and she found that this was, in combination with several other things she had been cataloging about him over the past weeks, entirely disarming. When they walked back toward the Sutherland house in the dark, because she had moved her things back there after the hearing, they stopped at the corner of the main street and she looked up at the sky, which was extraordinary. The way the sky in the Arizona territory often was at night, absolutely overcrowded with stars. "Albert," she said, using his first name deliberately and noting that it felt natural and not alarming, "when I said I would remain for the time being, I want to be honest about what I meant." "All right," he said. "I meant that I have not made a decision yet about what comes next. I have a life in Santa Fe that I built carefully, and I am not in the habit of setting aside careful things without reason." "That is wise," he said. "I also," she said, and here she paused, which was rare for her, "am aware that there may be reasons." He looked at her in the dark with his steady brown eyes, and the quiet stretched out between them in a way that was not empty. "I am not going to ask you to stay," he said. "That is a decision that belongs to you entirely, and I would not take it from you." "I know," she said. "I appreciate that." "But," he said, and then stopped. But she prompted. "But I would like you to know," he said carefully, "that the ranch is considerably better with you in it, not your legal interest in it, you, the person." He paused again. "I am not accustomed to saying things like that, so I am doing it badly, but I wanted to say it plainly." She looked at him for a long moment. "You did not do it badly," she said. "You did it very clearly." They stood there at the corner in the dark in Redemption, Arizona, in June 1882, and the air between them was warm and still and charged with everything that had not been said yet, and she thought about all the careful reasons, and also about the way he had smiled in the street outside the town hall, and she did not resolve anything that night, but she walked back to the Sutherland house knowing that the question had changed. It was no longer whether she would leave. It was whether she would choose to stay. The accounting process that followed the hearing took 6 weeks. She worked through it with Howell and a financial administrator Comstock had appointed, and the numbers, when they came clear, were considerable. Her father's stake, with 15 years of operating profits and the legal rate of interest, represented a sum that made Violet sit very still for a moment and breathe through the weight of it. It was enough to buy property, enough to establish herself independently, not as a bookkeeper in someone else's enterprise but as the principal in her own. She spent several evenings thinking about what that meant. About Santa Fe and about Redemption, and about a particular ranch house east of town with 3 dogs on the porch, and a kitchen table covered in documents, and a man who made coffee strong and plain, and who had looked at her like she was something worth looking at since the very first morning she had ridden up to his fence. She was honest with herself about what she felt. She had always been honest with herself. It was one of the few indulgences she permitted. What she felt was significant and specific, and not the kind of thing she was going to walk away from easily, and she knew it, and that knowledge was the most frightening and the most clarifying thing she had experienced in some time. In the 7th week after the hearing, on a morning when the summer heat had reached the uncomfortable intensity that would characterize the Arizona territory until September, she rode out to Albert's ranch not to work on documents, because the documents were concluded, but simply because that was where she was going. He was on the porch when she arrived. He usually was, early in the morning before the heat made the porch less comfortable. He had coffee and 2 cups, which meant either he had seen her coming or he had developed the habit of hoping. She tied her horse at the post and walked up to the porch and sat down with the cup he handed her, and they looked at the land in the early morning light, the red cliffs and the good grass and the cattle moving slow and quiet in the lower pasture. "I have been thinking about something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have enough now from the settlement to establish something of my own. I have been thinking about what that might look like." "What have you been thinking?" "I have been thinking that I understand this land. I have spent weeks learning its legal and operational history. I understand the water rights and the grazing patterns and the consortium structure." She paused. "I have also been thinking that a cattle operation of this size could support a more systematic approach to its financial management, the kind of oversight that would prevent the sort of mismanagement that Voss perpetrated for 15 years. He looked at her. "You are thinking about the financial management of this ranch," he said, and there was a careful neutrality in his tone that was covering something more interested. "I am thinking," she said, "about a partnership, a genuine one, with proper legal documentation and clear terms." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of partnership?" She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was golden and the air smelled of creosote and coffee, and the particular clean smell she had been breathing for 7 weeks, and she made a decision, and felt it settle into place the way a correct answer settles when you have been working a calculation from the wrong direction, and finally find the right one. "The kind," she said, "where I do not go back to Santa Fe." The silence that followed was the best kind of silence. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with the full direct attention he had given to everything from the beginning, and this time there was nothing professional about it, nothing careful or managed, just the simple and unambiguous truth of what he felt, which she could read clearly because she had been learning to read him for weeks and he was not hiding it anymore. "Violet," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it was the right moment for it. "I know," she said before he could say whatever he was going to say next. "I know what I am saying. I do not make decisions without knowing what I am saying." "I know you do not," he said. "That is one of the things." And then he said, "There are a great number of things." "Tell me one," she said. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. "The way you organized those documents the first morning you came to this kitchen table," he said. "By date and then by party and then by relevance. Before you even explained the case to me, the organization of the papers told me exactly who you were." She looked at him. "And who was that?" "Someone who was not going to be defeated," he said simply. "Someone who had not been defeated by things that would have defeated most people, and who was going to see this through to the right conclusion and who deserved to have someone with her when she did." She set down her own coffee cup. The 3 dogs were stretched in the morning sun at the edge of the porch, utterly indifferent to the magnitude of the moment. A hawk was describing a slow circle over the far cliffs. "Albert," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am going to stay." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and the warmth of it was steady and certain, the way everything about him was, and she thought that she had come here looking for her father's name and found something she had not been looking for and had not known how much she needed. They sat on the porch in the morning light holding hands while the hawks circled, and the cattle moved slow in the lower pasture, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. They were married in September of 1882 in the town of Redemption at the church that stood on the north end of the main street, a plain building with a single bell that the whole town could hear when it rang. Jeremiah Howell attended, with the relieved expression of a man who has navigated a difficult legal matter to a satisfactory conclusion. Mrs. Ida Sutherland attended with her perpetual expression of suspended judgment, which Violet had come to find privately entertaining. Most of the town attended, because Redemption was small enough that a wedding was a communal occasion, and because the story of the inheritance case and the forged documents and Theodore Marsh's humiliating departure was already the most interesting thing that had happened in Redemption in several years. Violet wore a blue dress she had ordered from a seamstress in Prescott, the color of late afternoon sky, and she wore her mother's silver locket, and she stood next to Albert Dawson in the plain church and made promises that she had thought about carefully, and meant with the same completeness she brought to everything important. Albert wore a suit he had ordered from the same city at considerable effort, and he looked at her during the ceremony with an expression so unguarded and certain that the minister had to clear his throat twice to bring his attention back to the words. The reception was held in the Sutherland House dining room, which Mrs. Ida Sutherland had agreed to on the grounds that she was, after all, a civic institution. There was food and there was fiddle music, and there was a general air of celebration that the territory did not provide opportunity for often enough. Albert danced with Violet, which she had not expected, because he moved with the same economy and purpose he brought to physical work, and it turned out that dancing, for a man like Albert Dawson, was simply another form of competence applied to a different problem. She laughed genuinely, and he smiled the wide, unguarded smile that she had decided, some weeks before this evening, was her absolute favorite thing. "You can dance," she said. "There was a woman in the next county who gave lessons," he said. "I thought it might be useful someday." "You planned ahead," she said. "I usually do," he said. They built their life with the same deliberate attention they had brought to the legal case, and it was a good life, which is to say a real one, full of both the satisfying and the difficult and the daily texture of two people choosing the same thing over and over. Violet took over the financial management of the ranch with an efficiency that transformed its operations within the first year. She established clear accounts, renegotiated supply contracts, identified inefficiencies in the cattle trading patterns that had been costing the operation money for years, and built a relationship with the territorial land office that meant their paperwork was never in question. Albert ran the physical operation with the same quiet competence he had always had, and together they expanded the herd and improved the water infrastructure and added a proper barn to the property. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with clear opinions, and neither of them was in the habit of abandoning a position without reason. Their arguments were more like negotiations, characterized by the same directness they brought to everything, and they generally reached conclusions that were better than either of them had proposed individually. They had worked out very early that this was going to be the pattern of their partnership, and they found it satisfying rather than exhausting. Violet wrote to her mother's sister in Tucson, whom she had not been in contact with for years, and received in return a letter full of the kind of warm and slightly chaotic family affection she had not experienced since childhood. She began a correspondence that became something important. She did not miss Santa Fe in the way she had expected to. She missed the library occasionally, and she ordered books through the general store, which delighted the proprietor, a man named Garrett, who had not had such an active book customer in his 20 years of operation. She missed certain conversations, and she found them gradually in redemption as she settled into the town, and the town settled into knowing her. She organized a small lending library in the back of Garrett's store, which became a fixture and a gathering point, and eventually a point of quiet pride for the whole settlement. In the spring of 1884, their son was born. They named him Benjamin, for her father, and Albert held the baby on the porch in the early evening light with an expression of such complete and unmanaged tenderness that Violet, watching from the doorway in the middle of her recovery, felt something so full and warm in her chest that it required a moment to simply breathe through it. Benjamin grew into a child who had his father's quiet steadiness and his mother's precision, and who very early demonstrated a talent for finding the category of thing that most concerned the adults around him, and investigating it with complete disregard for their anxiety. He was a loved child in the particular way that happens when two people who have learned to withhold love carefully finally decide to give it without reserve. Albert proved to be the kind of father Violet had known he would be, but that still moved her, present and patient and genuinely interested, who remembered what his son had told him 3 days ago and returned to it with questions, who could spend an afternoon teaching the mechanics of a windmill to a 4-year-old with the same full attention he brought to everything. In 1886, a daughter arrived. They named her Clara, and she was from the beginning a different kind of child entirely, loud and opinionated and physically fearless. And she was the delight and the exhausted amusement of the entire household and most of the town. Violet watched the ranch grow and her children grow, and the town of Redemption grow, which it did through the middle of the 1880s as the territory developed, and the railroad came closer, and the population of the whole region increased. She watched it all with the clear-eyed attention she had always brought to everything she did, and she kept her books and managed her accounts and lent her books and wrote her letters, and rode her horse in the early mornings when the air was still cool, and the light was that particular clean gold that she had never seen anywhere before the Arizona Territory. On an evening in the fall of 1887, she was standing at the split-rail fence at the edge of the property, at almost exactly the same spot where she had stood 5 years earlier with her travel bag at her feet and her horse at the post, and Albert watching her from the porch. She was not leaving this time. She was simply watching the sun go down over the cliffs, which she did most evenings when the children were fed and settled, and the day's work was concluded. It was the quiet ritual of a woman who had built something real out of the ruins of something lost, and who knew the value of standing still in it. She heard his steps on the porch and then on the ground, and then she felt him beside her at the fence, warm and familiar and steady as the land. "Benjamin found the iron box," Albert said. "The one in the floor, the very one. He has been using it as a repository for rocks he considers significant," she laughed. "How many rocks?" 11. Each of them with a quality he was prepared to explain at length. She was still laughing, and she turned to look at him in the last of the light. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn on this particular stretch of fence 5 years ago, but different now, richer. The way a landscape looks when you have lived in it long enough that you know every quality of its light. "I did not come here meaning to stay," she said quietly, because it was true, and because it still mattered to say true things. He looked at her, and the corners of his eyes creased with the warmth of his smile. "I know," he said, "and yet here you are." She turned back to the last colors of the sunset, leaning into his arm, feeling the familiar solid warmth of him, and thought about the girl who had ridden into Redemption with a single purpose and a carefully banked anger and a father's name in her chest. She thought about the letter from Jeremiah Howell and the man in the brass rail with his small pale eyes, and the documents on the kitchen table, and the morning on the porch with coffee, and the way everything had been building. From the first moment she had ridden up to this fence and found him watching her, toward this particular evening in this particular light. She thought about her father's capital B and the number 1200 and what it had grown into, not just the legal sum that Howell had calculated, but everything that had come from it, this land, this house, these children, this man, this life. "Albert," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I came." He pressed his lips to her temple briefly and gently in the way he had of expressing the largest things with the smallest gestures. "So am I," he said. The sun went down behind the red cliffs, and the first stars appeared in the deep blue of the Arizona sky, and the 3 dogs settled on the porch behind them. And in the house behind the dogs, Benjamin was explaining his rock collection to Clara, who was not old enough to understand and not interested in understanding, but who listened with the patience of a younger sibling who knows that her turn is coming. And Violet Baker Dawson stood at her fence on her land in her life and knew. With the same certainty she brought to every correct answer that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, not where she had expected to be, not where she had planned to be, but chosen. Chosen every morning for 5 years with the same fullness of will, and still choosing and glad of it, and intending to keep choosing for as long as the Arizona sunsets kept finding new ways to be extraordinary, and the man beside her kept being exactly who he was. Which was, she had come to understand, going to be a very long time. In 1889, when Arizona was still a territory, and the talk of statehood was beginning in earnest, Violet organized what became known, modestly, as the Redemption Land and Education Society, a lending library that had grown into a small but permanent institution, which acquired a dedicated room in a building next to Garrett's store, and which was funded by membership dues, and the surplus from a cattle sale that Violet had negotiated with characteristic precision. She hired a young woman named Sarah to manage it through the week, a woman who had come west with her family from Ohio, and who had the same quiet hunger for books that Violet recognized from her own younger years. Albert expanded the ranch's operations into horse breeding in 1889 as well, a decision they had discussed for 2 years before making, because they were people who discussed things at length and then made decisions they were going to hold to. The horses were good, well-bred and well-handled, and they developed a reputation through the territory for quality that brought buyers from Prescott and Flagstaff and eventually Tucson. Benjamin, at 5 years old, was found in the paddock sitting on a horse he had no business being on, having opened the gate himself and selected the most manageable of the young mares with what his father described, with a mixture of exasperation and pride, as very reasonable judgment. He was placed back on the ground without ceremony and told clearly why the paddock was not for unsupervised visits, and he listened with his mother's expression of composure, and then asked a series of highly specific questions about horse management that Albert answered fully, because there was no reasonable alternative. Clara, at 3, had already established herself as the axis around which the household turned, not through any specific behavior but through the quality of her attention, which was fierce and total and slightly alarming. She had her father's steady gaze applied to everything she considered, which was everything, and the combination of his composure and her mother's precision, in a 3-year-old who had not yet learned to moderate either quality, was something that the adults around her found simultaneously charming and slightly exhausting. The winter of 1889 was a good one in the sense that the cattle came through it well, and the water held, and the land remained productive. It was also the winter when Violet sat down one evening with Albert at the kitchen table that had held so many documents and so many working dinners and so many conversations that had built the architecture of their life together, and told him that there was going to be a third Baker Dawson child in the spring. He looked at her for a moment with the full direct attention she had always loved, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt the slight asymmetry of his left fingers where the bones had set imperfectly, which she had long since stopped noticing, except in the specific way that you notice the things that are most familiar and most dear. "Are you well?" he asked first because that was who he was. "I am very well," she said. "Then I am very glad," he said. The third child, a boy they named Thomas, arrived in May of 1890 and immediately demonstrated a temperament entirely distinct from either of his siblings, placid and observant and given to long silences that made him seem, even as an infant, like someone who was taking comprehensive notes. He looked very much like Albert, dark-haired and steady-eyed, and Albert looked at him with a kind of quiet wonder that Violet found, in the weeks of her recovery, the most reliable thing in the world to rest her eyes on. "3," Albert said one evening on the porch, with Benjamin and Clara both asleep inside and Thomas quiet in the crook of his arm. "3," she confirmed. "This porch is going to be very crowded," he said. "It is already crowded," she said, looking at the 3 dogs distributed across the boards with their usual indifference to human logistics. "We could build a larger porch," he offered. "We could," she said. They built a larger porch that autumn, extending it across the full front of the ranch house and adding a proper roof over it so that it could be used in the rain. Albert designed it and built most of it himself, with help from 2 of the ranch hands, and Violet managed the material costs with her usual precision, and Benjamin, at 6, held boards with the earnest helpfulness of a child who wants to be included, and Clara, at 4, provided extremely detailed opinions about everything, and got paint on herself immediately. The porch became the center of their evenings for the next decade and beyond. Long summer nights with the children on the boards and the stars overhead and the territory all around them, full of its vast quiet distances. Cold winter evenings with a fire in the brazier and blankets and the smell of wood smoke. Spring mornings when the desert bloomed in colors that still surprised Violet every year, as though she had not been watching it happen for years. In 1891, Arizona was still a territory, still building its case for statehood, and Redemption was a town that had grown steadily if quietly, and the Baker-Dawson Ranch was a going concern of some real reputation in the region. And Violet Baker Dawson was 35 years old, and in possession of the life she had chosen. She thought sometimes about the boarding house in Santa Fe, about the careful and narrow life she had maintained there, the safety of its limits. She thought about the man in the brass rail with his small pale eyes and his modest offer of money in exchange for her father's name. She thought about Jeremiah Howell's careful legal neutrality and Judge Comstock's efficient justice, and the way the word convincingly had hung in the air of the town hall like evidence of everything human beings are capable of when they decide that someone else's loss is their gain. She thought about her father, who had believed in something good enough to put all his money into it, and who had been cheated not just of the money, but of the knowledge that it had eventually been recovered, that his capital B and its distinctive double loop had survived long enough to tell the truth about a forged signature and restore what was owed. She had put his name in the lending library. There was a small plaque above the door of the room next to Garrett's store, a dedication that read in memory of Benjamin Baker, who believed in something worth believing in. It was not elaborate. Her father had not been an elaborate man. But it was there, permanent and specific in the town where the wrong had been made right. On a Saturday afternoon in September of 1891, Albert found her in the library room, sitting in the chair by the window going through a catalog of new books from a publisher in Chicago with Thomas asleep in her lap, and the afternoon light coming through the glass in long, warm bars, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "You look settled," he said. She looked up. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression open and warm, and the afternoon light was on his face, and he was 39 years old, and she knew his face now as well as she knew anything in the world. "I am settled," she said. "Good," he said. He came and sat in the chair beside her and looked at the catalog she was holding. "Find anything worth ordering?" "Several things," she said. "There is a new natural history of the Southwest Territories that I think Benjamin would like." "He would take it apart to find out how it was made," Albert said. "That is why he would like it," she said. He smiled. She watched him smile, the real one, wide and unguarded, that she had been cataloging for 9 years, and that still did what it had done the first time she saw it in the street outside the town hall. Thomas stirred in her lap and settled again without waking, and the afternoon was quiet around them, and Violet Baker Dawson sat in the library she had built in the town she had chosen in the life she had made, and felt the completeness of it settle through her like something permanent, like the red cliffs in the morning or the stars over the territory at night, like all the enduring and unhurried things. She had not come here meaning to stay, but she was here. And she knew with the whole of herself that she would keep choosing it every morning for as long as mornings came. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.